just to get started, my name is Charlene Margot. I'm co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are so happy to have with us tonight Sahaj Kohli, who is going to be talking with us about her new book, along with Jackie Tan, co-director of the Mercer Island Parent Edge. All right, Sahaj, let's start out by asking, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? What brought you to write this book at this time?
Yeah, first, thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation and being here. As an author, when I get that question, it's often really hard for me to answer because I think all of my life experiences have led me to write this book. I'm the first in my family to be born in the West. I am the first in my family to go to therapy. I'm the first in my family to marry outside of race, religion, and culture. I'm the first in my family to be a financially independent woman. So there's so many firsts that I feel like I have done in my family, in my lineage, that has both been amazing, but has also led me to struggle with my mental health, to question my own bicultural identity as an Indian American, to wonder if I am Indian enough, if I'm American enough. All of these things that I think so many other immigrants, children of immigrants, third gen immigrants experience. And so it all kind of accumulated to me wanting to do this work and then deciding to pursue a second career after working in journalism for 7 years to become a therapist. And in my therapy program, I realized that my collectivist values as an Indian woman were not being represented in what I was learning as a therapist. Instead, I was being taught from a very individualistic lens, which did not fit with the way that I wanted to interact with my own relationships, how I engage with my own immigrant parents, and within my community. And so I decided to start Brown Girl Therapy, was blown away by how quickly it grew. And one thing led to another. And the book just felt like the right next step to shed light on these experiences that we don't talk about. Culture is not infused enough in our conversations around wellness.
Sahaj, can you tell us a little bit more about Brown Girl Therapy, what it is and why you started it? I loved your story about sitting on the sheet there in the park in New York with your new best friends.
Yes, yeah. So when I decided to start Brown Girl Therapy back in 2019, I was starting a new career in therapy. I was back to grad school, and I was also just getting married to my white American husband, which is important because it led to a lot of professional and personal identity crises for me. I was questioning if choosing this partner meant I was saying no to where I come from, if I was betraying my family in some way, choosing to start over in a new career when I was leaving a career where I had a very stable job and at a prestigious organization made me question if I was making a mistake, especially with narratives around success in my own family, about staying on the same path, about like rising the ranks. And I knew that I couldn't possibly be the only person wondering and asking these questions. And so when I started Brown Girl Therapy, I decided to just do a call out and ask people who's in New York, who wants to like meet up and talk about these things. And I was surprised by the fact that with, only I think 100 followers, 15 people showed up at the park to talk about our experiences as bicultural folks. And honestly, it was supposed to be 1 hour, led to 4 hours of talking about parents, parenting, grief, mental health, therapy, career, relationships, marriage, dating, all of these things that I was surprised so many of us were being so open to each other about when we were essentially strangers. But it only reinforced for me this need that I was seeing in this field, so that there's this void of us not bridging that cultural gap when we talk about relationships, wellness, mental health. There isn't one right way to be well. There isn't one right way to be in relationships with other people. There's not one right way to succeed. And yet we are often told stories, whether it's from our own families or the dominant society, of what we're supposed to look like, how we're supposed to act, what we're supposed to pursue. And the crux of my work is really challenging that and saying, where do these stories come from? And what can we do to reauthor them so they feel more empowering and also honor the fact that many of us are living between many different cultures?
Absolutely. So, Sahaj, we're going to touch on this throughout our conversation tonight, but I want to ask you again, I don't expect the full answer here because then you'd have to describe the whole book. But um, how did your personal journey influence some of your themes? In the book, I was struck by how very transparent you were about your challenges, Some of them, as you say, you really hadn't told people, but now it's kind of out there, so they probably know.
Yeah, for anyone who hasn't read the book, what Charlene is talking about is that it took me 12 years to graduate with my bachelor's degree. And that was something that I felt a lot of shame for personally. I thought it was a moral failure that I was struggling in my academics. In high school, I had done really well. I was top of my class. I had felt a lot of pressure from my immigrant parents to do the best, to be the best, to again rise the ranks, make sure that I am securing my own success and safety and security in this country through academia. And when I got to college, I was, if I'm being very honest, which I was in the book, I was very emotionally immature. I didn't have the discipline for the freedom that was now at my hands now that I was living outside of my parents' house. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew what was expected of me. I knew that, signing up for pre-med right away would look good, that my parents would approve of that, but it's not necessarily something that I wanted. And I didn't do well in those classes. And instead of knowing that I could ask for help, that I could talk to my parents, that I could open up to a friend, that I could even go to my professors and say, hey, I'm struggling, that there was even a counseling center on campus for me. I didn't know any of that. Instead, I took it as a personal moral failure that I was not doing well. Instead of it being, I'm not doing well and something needs to change, I took it as, I'm not doing well, therefore I as a person am a failure. And in writing the book, it felt really important for me to be really honest about this. I believe in the power of stories. I believe in the power of vulnerability for us to connect with one another. I also believe that by being honest about my story, I knew that so many people out there like me would feel less alone and feel more empowered to ask for help, to reach out for connection. And honestly, the book's been out for almost a year, and the amount of messages and emails I get in general about the book, but very specifically about the fact that I was honest about struggling with academia and how much people related to that very specific element has really touched me. I really think that we feel a lot of shame personally as people about things that don't look good, quote unquote, to other people. That's why I named my book, But What Will People Say? Because there's such a concern for what people are going to think about us. We are worried about how we're going to be perceived. We worry about judgment. And honestly, for those of us who are children or grandchildren of immigrants, some of that mentality has been passed down out of survival. Our parents or our grandparents may have moved or immigrated or have been refugees who have had to worry about what people think about them in order to survive. They have had to protect themselves and their image in order to survive in new societies and cultures. And that makes sense. And I can honor what my parents have been through. And I've had a lot of really painful, but also beautiful conversations with my parents because of the book, because of sharing my story. And I can honor that I'm in a different generation. I have different access to resources and opportunities they didn't have. And I have, because of them, the momentum to now lead to some more change in our family lineage, to be able to pursue different things, do things differently, change my mind, slow down, pursue two different careers, maybe three in my lifetime, who knows? And I think that's the beauty of really honoring where we come from while also having the courage to take that momentum forward. So all of that is to say that I think being really honest about my story felt really important because there aren't many self-help books like this, and I didn't want my book to speak to people from a higher than thou perspective where I'm the expert, I know best, I can tell you what to do. I wanted it to feel like I am a community member first and foremost. I have been there. I've lived through a lot of what my readers and the readers who are attracted to this book have lived through. And I am a therapist who has done research on this community for years, almost a decade. I also have a skill set and tools that I want to pass on. So I think that combination just felt really important.
It's so interesting you say all that, Sahaj. When my daughter was in college, she actually joined the Latina Club. She's not Latina, but she found those girls to be the most authentic at this kind of high pressure college in the Bay Area. But she found out that none of them asked for help. None of them went to professor hours. None of them went to a mental health center, even when they were really struggling. So that experience we know is pretty common in children of immigrants, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. There's lots of research that I cite in my book about, freshmen, the freshman class of, particularly BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color,
Yeah.
struggling with their mental health more than their white counterparts. I think there is, also for many immigrants and children of immigrants, they may be first gen college graduates or college goers. So they're also navigating that system as first timers in their family. So there's a lot of like pressure and struggle for that. Then there's also just the, sense of gratitude and guilt that a lot of us have for what our parents and our ancestors have been through, lived through, sacrificed, have done to get us to where we are. And that can, it's almost like a rice cooker situation. There's just all this pressure, and at any given time, for many of us, it can blow. But that's why we need to know, we need to have skills to be able to release that steam slowly. We need to know how to manage our mental health, whether it's practical tools like grounding and emotional expression and emotion management, but also the harder things like seeking help, asking for help, connection, community. And a lot of that is just interconnected. It's the narratives that we've been taught, the narratives that are told to us about us. And really, it's conversations like this that I think are so important to destigmatize mental health, destigmatize asking for help, but also, democratize and make sure that this education reaches the people who need it.
Absolutely. So Sahaj, before I turn you over to my friend Jackie, would you define for us individualist versus collective societies? Because I know she's going to be asking you more about family dynamics and intergenerational healing.
Yeah, certainly. So when I talk about being bicultural and biculturalism, often the most oversimplified way to explain that is that someone is straddling between a collectivist culture and an individualist culture. So individualist cultures are often the values around individualism are around, asserting your own autonomy, taking care of your own needs, having being your own individual essentially. Whereas in collectivist cultures, a lot of those values are around group harmony, are around saving face or protecting family and group and community reputation and putting others first. So really the example I like to give people is in one culture, you might be encouraged to take care of yourself sometimes at the expense of your relationships and other people. Whereas in the other culture, you are sometimes encouraged to take care of other people, sometimes at the expense of yourself and your own needs and feelings. So when you are straddling between those two, the way I grew up in an Indian conservative, traditional religious household, but I was socialized in a Western American, predominantly white area in the suburbs of Virginia. I was straddling between being at home where there was an expectation of how I was supposed to behave as an Indian daughter, as a woman, how I was allowed to dress, all of these things. But then I was socialized in an environment where I was encouraged to have more freedom, to speak up, to be more liberated in certain ways. And one culture over the other is not better or worse. It's just that at their extreme, they can both be harmful. And when you are straddling them, you're quite honestly straddling diametrically opposing norms, expectations, and values at any given moment. And that bicultural straddling, that's the term, can lead to, pride, courage. It can lead to adaptability, resourcefulness, but it can also lead to tension, mental health struggles. There has been research that says at different points where if there is a gap between immigrant parents and their kids when it comes to the ways they acculturate, which we can talk about more, but the ways that they will adapt to the new society, if there's a big gap between immigrant parents and their kids, that can lead to more conflict in the family, academic issues, use of substances. So we want to be mindful of this because it's all related, right? These relationships are so important, but they are impacting both the parent and the children at any given moment.
Thank you for that. I think one of my favorite themes was the love that you show for your parents really shines through this book, even though it wasn't easy,
Mhm.
as we can tell.
Yeah, yeah, it wasn't. And I love my parents dearly, and I'll be honest, for my, young adult life, we didn't know how to communicate with each other. I didn't have tools that I have now, which is why I do a lot of work with families and parents and children of immigrants. And a lot of my work is how do we bridge that cultural gap? How do we bridge that generational gap? Because it really is so beautiful when we can come together and find those parallels, show curiosity, and connect with one another. And because I know what it's like to not have such a great relationship with my parents, and then be able to come back to it and work really hard at building something more beautiful, it really means so much to me. And I'm so grateful for them too, because they've shown, they've shown a lot of, they've done a lot of work that I know has been hard for them in meeting me also where I am, so I can also meet them where they are.
That's right. If we have time at the end, you can tell us more about your wedding. All
Uh,
right. Those of you who may have just joined us, the Parent Venture, our organization, is partnering today with Mercer Island Parent Edge. And we have with us Jackie Tan, who's co-director of that program. And Jackie has some questions for some heads as well.
First, I just want to say I love the clever use of your book title, What Would People Say? It's like a cultural inside joke. And I've talked now to several friends who have told me that this is a common saying in Hindu or Urdu, or Urdu, and they all know the implications of what this statement means. So like you are seen as an extension of your family, and how you behave affects how I raised you. And
Mhm.
as a counselor, so I'm a counselor in training, an intern, we know there's a specific fear behind that. And so I just want to ask you, like, how do you help someone explore what is that fear behind that? How?
yeah. There's different ways to do that. Clinically, there are some ways that I'm happy to share, but also just generally when we are in relationships with people who come from different cultures, the biggest thing is just curiosity. Even with my friends who are American and don't come from Indian culture, right, are
Mhm.
able to ask me questions like, well, what was it like for you growing up? Or how does, what are the traditions that you have in your Indian heritage? How can we do that together? Those are just really small. They feel really inconsequential, but they actually allow someone to show up fully as all parts of themselves. So when we are working with people, whether it's like as a teacher or whether you're a parent, whether you're a clinician, being more culturally responsive is just so important. The first way to do that is for us, all of us individually, me included. It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter how you identify. We want to always be aware of our own biases, the assumptions that we make about what it means to be well. What does healthy look like? What does it mean to be
Mhm.
close to someone? Because those definitions look very different across cultures, very different across families, very different depending on who you ask. The way that I see my family and healthiness and closeness might look like codependency and enmeshment for someone else. Or
Mhm.
for someone else, for even someone else, it might look like not enough, right? That's not close enough. So we cannot make assumptions on what other people, the choices that they make, the ways they live their life, how they navigate multiple cultures, um, without showing curiosity. So to your question though, because I feel like I rambled a little bit, but to your question about, but what will people say? I think that fear, something is protecting us. That fear is protecting us from something that we are scared of, right? There's often a belief, a core belief that you are not good enough if someone finds out something about you, that you are letting or betraying your family, if you do something wrong or that was not expected of you, that you are not smart or worthy if you fail. These core beliefs can tie to us then tying our self-concept around that belief. I have to
Mhm.
act a certain way in order to be lovable. I have to do this in order for my parents to approve of me. I have to act this way in order to be accepted in this friend group. And those are the things that we worry about, right? Because we all want a sense of belonging. We all want a sense of connection. And so we really want to understand what those fears are. Where did we learn them? How did we learn that we wouldn't be accepted if we did something differently? And I think that's kind of the point that I want to drive home in the book.
Yeah. No, I think those of us who are doing the bicultural straddling, which is definitely me growing up. I grew up in Canada, um, in a Filipino family.
Mhm.
Um, you grow up with those strategies that your parents developed, like um, maintaining the family kind of like culture, image. And then as children who are growing up in that culture, we do have to negotiate. And that process of negotiation with your parents can be very difficult. So that's why I think it's so touching to see. I recently watched your video of your parents reading the book dedication, because
Oh, yeah.
for them to come to a place where they're seeing their lives being basically evaluated publicly, and but coming to a place of becoming growing and growing closer to you, and through this whole going through the hard process, it's really beautiful to see that you can honor, but also work through the hard things.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, you know, I didn't write the book from the wound. I wrote from the scar.
Mm,
It's often something I like to tell people. I didn't write in the middle of my pain, or as, you know, this book would have been very different if I wrote it 10 or 15 years ago when I was still processing a lot of our relationship, healing from a lot of those wounds. It might have been more angry, less flexible, more rigid, unforgiving of my parents. But because I've done a lot of work, you know, I'm not perfect, but I've done a lot of work. I've been to therapy. I've worked on my mental health. I've tried to meet my parents where they are. Because of those years of doing that work, I'm
mm,
able to write from the scar where I can be more compassionate, have empathy, understand that both of our perspectives and views are valid. They might be different, but how do we connect? How do we still maintain a relationship even if we see things differently? And I'm very glad, you know, specifically my dad, that he's been able to have these hard conversations with me. He's been able to meet me there. We go on father-daughter trips every year for the last 5 or 6 years, and people are always surprised. I could never spend that long with my dad alone, especially as a daughter of immigrants. Like
mm,
I was meant to fear my dad. I was meant for him to be the authoritarian figure. I was meant for him not to like be the emotional, cuddly guy that I see your dad being on these trips. And
mm.
that's because we've worked really hard at the relationship. And I can't do it alone. We can't have relationships by ourselves. A relationship is between two people. And so it really does take two people to get the relationship to that point. And I feel very lucky that my dad has been able to meet me there.
So for our audience who are wondering, well, how did you take that first step? Like, how did you begin setting healthy boundaries with your parents while honoring their cultural values?
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting one because it's ongoing. I wish that I could wave a wand or say give you one tip and everyone here could leave and be like, "Great, I have the tip. Things are going to be great between me and my immigrant
You
parents,"
do
or
have a chapter in the book about it.
I have a whole chapter, yeah, but you know what I think is important for me for what I've done and what's worked for me and what I usually tell people is begin by recognizing and acknowledging the cultural values that your parents instilled in you, right? So for me, it's I understand the values of the Sikh faith, which is rooted in social justice, equality, community service. I'm not particularly religious the way my parents are, but I can bond with them over those values they've instilled in me. Respect for elders, family loyalty, right? Duty. I can still understand those cultural values and respect them and really value that they have made me part of who I am. And by acknowledging those values, I'm coming at it from I love that you've taught me this. You are why I am the way I am, right? When I speak out on injustices and my dad gets scared because he doesn't want me to get hurt or doesn't want me to lose a job, I tell him, "You've taught me this. You've taught me to speak up, that we should be for social justice." And we're able to connect over a value he's taught me. It helps reassure our parents that we are not losing connection to where we're coming from. I think one of the number one fears immigrant parents have is a fear of cultural erasure. They are terrified that they moved to this country by choice or not, that they are now making choices every day as their kids are growing up, and their kids are going to forget where they came from. Because that's I can't imagine how painful that must feel to worry about that. And I'm able to connect with my parents on that and say, you are worried about cultural erasure, but here's how I am still maintaining roots with my culture while also welcoming and adopting some of these more Western values. It does
Mm.
not mean I'm forgetting where I'm coming from. And my parents, you know, it's ironic because I'm married to a white American man. They're like, "You're more Indian than you've ever been." And I'm like, "Yeah, because I don't like that doesn't who I choose as a partner doesn't take away the fact that this is important to me. I will always make it a priority." And so there are ways that we can have these conversations, set boundaries with them while also speaking the language they understand.
Yeah.
So with that said, boundary as a term probably won't fly. I could never imagine going to my immigrant parents and saying, "I'm setting a boundary." I think they would laugh in my face.
I was just saying they
I
laugh.
think they would like, or they would just get really angry. Like, I don't know. They would just wouldn't understand that concept. So we also
Yeah.
want to speak the same language, whether it's literally the same language, right? If your parents speak another language, or find other ways to communicate what you mean without having it feel so rigid. Often when I work on boundaries with adult children of immigrants, we're thinking about communication styles. in immigrant families, we are not direct communicators. We are high contextual communicators, which means
No.
depending on who you communicate with, what the context is, you will understand what's happening. It's not all about what you say explicitly and directly. Whereas in a Western world, we're taught be assertive, speak directly, say no. Those are not things that will necessarily fly for some of us in immigrant households. So when I
Mhm.
work with these people, I say, okay, what are other ways to set boundaries? Maybe it's behavioral boundaries. Instead of verbal boundaries where you say the thing you're setting a boundary around, how do you protect your time by maybe calling your mom, back when you're done with work rather than feeling like you have to pick up and tell her you can't talk? That might be more uncomfortable than just making the time after work or how long you go home for. So thinking about the ways you can enact in or engage in behaviors that help you set those boundaries without having to communicate them directly. And compromise and negotiation. It's constantly the relationships are in constant state of compromise and negotiation.
I like that you gave out those practical tips because I think sometimes when this is your whole world and you've never had a chance to think about different solutions and different ways to process that. It's so important to find a community where you can process that and learn
Yeah.
from yours. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's why I built Brown Girl Therapy because
Mhm.
I didn't have this community, and I'm so happy to be able to build it and have it myself as well, as much as like being able to give it to other people.
I want to move into a question about redefining success. So
Mhm.
many immigrant parents equate success with traditional achievements like a high status job, financial security. How do we navigate conversations about redefining success on our own terms?
This is a good one. This is a very common one, and
Mhm.
um, it's also ongoing, but I will say that there are practical things that we can all do. We can understand where our immigrant parents came from. I can understand that for my parents, I write about this in the book, they operated from a place of always prioritizing the three S's: safety,
Mm.
stability, and security. For them, everything that we did as kids needed to make sure that it was leading us on the path of safety, stability, and security. Because they moved here, didn't have that stability and safety and security, so they wanted to make sure that they were making choices and encouraging us to make choices, my siblings and I, to have those three things because they didn't want our lives to be hard. And for them, hard was anything that was not in what they understood to give us that stability, safety, and security. So that was certain career paths that would make certain amount of money, that was marrying certain people within our culture and community, that was, the choices we made when we were in high school and younger, how we spent our time. Were we focusing on our academics or were we like, frolicking with our friends, right? Though they understood that there were certain things we needed to do to make sure we had that safety, stability, and security. And looking back when I was younger, it felt like my parents were controlling, it felt like they were rigid, but I can understand now that they were scared. And so I
Mm.
think we need to have a
Yeah.
general conversation around the fact that many immigrant parents want the best for their kids. They believe that that high pressure academic mindset is what will help their kids succeed. And based on where they're operating from, they're not wrong. But what we can do is express appreciation for that, express an understanding of why they're coming from that perspective, and then understand that there are different definitions of success and have those conversations. Well, when you moved here, your definition of success was building that safety, security, and stability. But now that we have it, that is no longer something that I am concerned about. So, my definition of success, because you have given me the privilege to be able to have access to so many more opportunities and resources, is looking like having a more balanced life or pursuing a creative career that feels more fulfilling or marrying someone who, makes me happy in a certain way that might not look like we share the same religion or culture. And so being able to just redefine success, understanding and honoring where they're coming from while also understanding that success looks different for everyone. I think it's also, ultimately comes down to fixed versus growth mindset. I think for a lot of people, um, I think immigrants and immigrant parents can often be very trapped in a fixed mindset. And that's not a bad thing because it's what allowed them to get to where they are. They were able to say, I have this one chance. I have to be good at it. I have to trust my instincts. I have to make these decisions in real time. And that is all I have, right? There's no abundance. There's no chances to start over. There's no chances to change your mind. It's like you have this fixed way that you have to do it. And everything is banking on it. Whereas for many of us, we now can operate from a growth mindset. We have the already like foundation of success and I mean safety, security, that and stability that our parents gave us, that we can change our mind, that we can take a little bit more risk, that we can bank on happiness a little bit more than maybe monetary success and financial achievement. And I think that that's really important because a growth mindset is also a way for us to focus on learning rather than outcome. Focus on, you know, what we're experiencing and learning rather than what we achieve. And I think that that is such a beautiful reframe that I think we all need to kind of consider.
Yes, that is a great answer. Yeah. We had, I think Parent Edge had our Parent Venture had a great session on that.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So another question is, in your opinion, how can parents better integrate mental health discussions into family life, especially in communities where therapy is stigmatized?
Ah, that's a good one. So, you know, I think that we need to normalize it, first of all. I think that we can normalize it by exposing ourselves to different medias around that have mental health as theme. So when we can find inroads to talk about mental health that makes it feel less personal, it's an easier conversation to have. So what I mean by that is when I was first struggling with my mental health decades ago, I didn't go home to my mom and dad and say, we're going to sit down and we're going to now have this really heavy conversation about depression, because I knew that would go way over their head. Instead, I watched, what did I do? I forget what movie I watched, but oh, it was an interview. It was an interview with their favorite Bollywood actress.
Uh,
There was like a clip in the interview where she talks about anxiety. And
mm,
so we watched it and then I was like, what did you think about that?
mm,
How would like do you ever feel anxiety? Like do you think that's a thing? What would you say if I was feeling that? Like I used it as an inroad to just have a bigger conversation around the concept, which allowed us to then talk about it. It also allowed me to understand what their fears were. Well, you know, it means you're crazy, or it just means you don't have enough structure, or you know, it means that you're going to have a harder time in life. And I was able to then understand where they were coming from to then say, okay, these are fears that I can then address with them. Because oftentimes these conversations are difficult because someone, if not everyone, is scared. There's a fear that is like, there's a stigma around the concept of mental health. And we want to be able to address those fears. I think also like making shared goals. The goal isn't I'm going to go to therapy so I can like learn how to say no to my parent. I might talk to my parents and say, my goal for going to therapy is so I can, you know, have better time management skills so I can do better in school. My parents
mhm,
can, you know, my parents would be able to understand that reframe of why I'm going. Or the shared goal could be, you know, if I'm setting a boundary, it's not, I don't want to spend time with you this weekend. It's, I want to really spend quality time with you. And I know that I will be able to do that uninterrupted without having to check my email for work if I see you next weekend instead. So that is, I'm not taking something away from them. I'm focusing on our shared goal together in our relationship or what we both can understand.
mm,
And the last thing I'll say is sometimes with social media and you know the rise of therapy language, it's not a bad thing because it's good that we all have education around it, but it can be when we start to like weaponize it, we start to just use it colloquially in the wrong way, when we start to use these like bigger terms like narcissism, gaslighting, boundaries without context. And cultural context matters. And it's really important for us to understand that, again, going back to like that language use, what words you use, how you talk about it, so that it can really be understood by the other party. And I think one of the things I tell people, I have clients who do have depression and they want to
mm,
talk about it with their parents. You know, they're like, they're not going to understand what the word depression means. If they're going to hear that word and they're going to immediately shut off, or they're going to have fears, or they're not going to be able to have a conversation. So one of the skills is sometimes bringing research around what depression is, what its impact is, because I think a lot of immigrant dads respond more to the science behind it. And I think the second thing is focusing on executive functioning. So
mm,
again, talking about it in a way the parents can understand. I feel it's so hard for me to wake up in the morning and do well in school because
mm,
I feel like I have this heaviness in my head. That is something that a parent can understand. Okay, you're struggling in school because of this. Wait, we need to get this figured out. Instead
mm,
of being like, I'm depressed and I can't wake up. Those are two very different ways to communicate the same thing, but one of them is more culturally contextual so that the other party can understand.
yeah, totally get that. Um, so as a counseling intern, I encounter clients of immigrant backgrounds who experience this painful experience of having an adult child cut them off. So this is the topic of parental estrangement. And, for those of us who come from cultures that really value honoring your parents, um, it's a really painful experience. How would you help client who's going through this?
Are
Or
you
even like
are you
pardon me,
talking about the parent or the kid?
the parent, and then the flip side is how would you counsel an adult child who's considering cutting off their parents?
I'm going to start with that first, and then I'll
Okay.
go to the parent. Oftentimes, I think it's easy to hear. I do work with families, and I have in the past, and I have worked with estranged family members. And the minute someone says, I can no longer have a relationship with you, or is doing something to pull away from a relationship, it's very easy for the other party to say, they don't care about me anymore. They're not talking to me anymore. If they did, they would like stay in this relationship rather than understanding. So to the adult child,
Hmm.
I would understand first and foremost, no one chooses estrangement just willy-nilly. No one says, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and just decide to be estranged from my parent. It is a very painful process to get to the point where you're even considering not having a relationship with a parent. By default, we are all wired for that attachment with a caregiver. We are all wired for that love and that connection. And so for someone to get to a point to say, I have to now cut this off, I can only imagine the amount of pain, the amount of attempts, the amount of tries that that person might have made with that parent before deciding I have to do this now. And so if I was working with the adult child, I would work with them on the values that they feel like they're crossing. I would work on processing the grief of what it means to not have a relationship with a parent the way you want. Oftentimes, an adult child is choosing estrangement because there's abuse present, because there's a lack of reconciliation, a lack of accountability from the parent. There's a lack of communication. There's a lack of feeling understood or heard. There's parts of their identity that are being dismissed and invalidated. And those are all very hard, painful things. And I think, in immigrant families specifically, what I often see is that family is the most important value. Family should be more important than anything else. We love family no matter what. But the truth is, and this might be a really hard truth for people to hear,
Hmm.
love under the abuse under the guise of love is still abuse. So we need to understand that, there are repercussions for when we are acting in ways that is causing real harm to the people that we say we love. And if we're not willing to interrogate that or hold accountability for that, then why would we think that people would want to stay in the relationship? And to and I talk about this with my clients in a way to understand what are the norms in culture. I write about this in the first chapter of my book. Just because something's always been done one way, or just because we have elders in our family or other sibling or other members in our family who stay in painful relationships, just because it is the way it's done, because family is so important, doesn't mean that it's healthy. We cannot use culture or cultural norms on either side, whatever culture we're talking about, as a scapegoat for being in painful and abusive situations. And so I think that that's really hard. And I think with the adult child, I would process a lot of that. And a lot of that would be grief work. Now, if
Hmm.
I was working with the parent, it would be a different conversation because I think it would depend where the parent is coming from. Is the parent angry and not understanding why this happened? I think that the work there would be meeting the parent where they are, right? And trying to understand their fears, what their assumptions were, what values they're rooting in that are leading them to feel like they are being wronged in some way. And then I think that it would take a long time. I'm saying this in a very simplified way, but that is a long process to work with a parent on that because it is another form of it can feel, it's not, I'm not going to say it is, it can feel like a form of abandonment to have your kids say, I no longer want to have a relationship with you. So I think there's a healing part of that while also honoring or while also addressing where they're coming from and trying to challenge that after we've built rapport and like understand the nuances of the situation. Honestly, I think it's grief work on both parts, but I also think the one thing that I think is really hard when I work with estranged family members is reconciliation cannot happen without both parties willing to take accountability and try something different. And what is very common in immigrant households is communication. whether it's good or bad. I'm not going to pass judgment. Like, we communicate with each other. Conflict, we know, is normal in all relationships. But the one thing I see is lacking is the repair aspect. And
Mhm.
reconciliation needs repair. In order for us to have healthy relationships with one another, healthy relationships with our parents, to feel heard and seen as adults who are like making choices in our lives, there needs to be repair. And that is something that is really hard if you have never been taught to express your emotions, if you've never been taught conflict resolution, if you've never been taught communication skills. And so we're going back to the basics, like thinking about that parent who might have a kid who's estranging themselves. We're going back to the basics of like, how do you even interact? What's the norm in your relationship? What did you hope was going to be the relationship? How did you think that was going to happen? What was your role in that? These are all really big and hard questions, but it really is like it's like an onion. You're just peeling back the layers one by one.
Wow.
So thank
Great
you,
answer.
Jackie. And did you want to finish the thought, Jackie? We're going to need to turn to some of the questions from the audience.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sahaj and Jackie. Fantastic conversation. All right, Sahaj, in the minutes that we have left together, we have some really deep questions from people in the audience. So let's give it a try, see how many we can get to.
Okay.
First, we'll start easy. How important is it to work with a therapist from your own culture?
That depends on you. So I tell people all the time that if you think you will be more comfortable with someone who shares in your culture, then look for that. If you are processing something that is very cultural, specific, culturally nuanced, maybe you want someone who can understand that. But is it necessary? No. I have worked with therapists who come from all cultures, and honestly, what varied was what I was working on, how comfortable I felt, and how culturally responsive they were. And it's really important to remember that the number one indicator of success in therapy is your comfort as a client. So if you do not think you will be comfortable, if you are not comfortable with your therapist, that might be a sign you need someone else, regardless of like background.
Okay, thank you. Really important to know. Okay, here we go. Writer says, I'm a brown girl with a very similar background to yours. I'm also a parent of three who's wondering how to parent my kids differently than I was raised. What are some tips for those of us who still value the collectivist family structure, but want to do away with the pressures of immigrant families?
Yes. Honor the cultural values that are really important to you, right? Uphold those traditions, even if it's in new hybrid ways to maintain that connection with the culture with your kids. But one thing that I see second gen immigrants as parents doing with their kids that maybe immigrant parents didn't do with their kids is showing that curiosity. How are they relating to their bicultural identity? What are their experiences that they're having in school? How is that shaping the way they view themselves? For instance, I have nephews and they all keep their hair. So they have long hair, they've been bullied, they've been told they're girls, they wear their bun on their head with a butka with a cloth on their head. So they've experienced things that have made them feel more shame in their religious and cultural identity, and they've experienced things that bring them more pride, like being able to have a presentation on Sikhism in their school and showcasing that to their friends. So you want to, as a parent, show that curiosity, understand the experiences they have that lead to shame and pride, so that you can really help them navigate and communicate through that. You also want to model some of this stuff, model emotional expression, model communication, model your own relationship with your cultural identity. And lastly, I will just say to anyone, if you're asking me this, then you already know what you want to do differently. Remember that it's about presence, not perfection. No parent is perfect. It's about being present with your kids and really being mindful that just because you do things differently from your parent doesn't mean it's better. You want to actually interrogate what you were taught or how you were parented in ways that might have, like, be more specific, be very specific about the parts of your parenting, like parts of your childhood of the way that you are parented that feel hurtful and how you might want to change that. I'm trying
Okay,
to talk really fast so I can get through these.
I know, and I know we're trying to bring it in on time, Sahaj. I don't know if you have an extra 5 minutes.
Sure, I do. Yeah.
All right, thank you for that. Here we go. Another family question, a great one. Our 17-year-old Indian adopted daughter is being raised in an Australian American Silicon Valley house. She's strongly rejecting traditional Indian values. She feels that the culture is not inclusive. She says, Mama, I'm a coconut. I feel white on the inside, but brown on the outside. Do you have any advice for us?
Oh man. I would really advise you and her maybe to look up racial identity development models. Um, specifically, even in my book, I'm not trying to sell my book here, but there is a bicultural identity development model in one of the chapters. And a part of why I'm saying bring in the development models is because you'll understand that there are different stages to how we as racialized and cultured beings and all racialized people, there's a white identity development model. So we all have these relationships with our identity in different ways, and we all kind of go through these stages that make us feel more connected and less connected. And I think being able to have that language, just that framework for yourself, can help you understand a little bit more about how to approach her. But I also want to remind you that this is not permanent, right? You can show curiosity, you can have exposure, you build up her self-esteem. I'm hearing a lot of like maybe even shame around how she looks, how she's perceived. It's very common. And so I would really use curiosity to understand more of the specifics around her experiences and her fears and those development models to frame some of those conversations.
All right, and she could hop on Brown Girl Therapy on Instagram.
Exactly. Yes.
All right, here's a good question, and then we'll wrap pretty quickly. Do you think increased media awareness about mental health in South Asia is bridging the generational gap, or do parents still struggle to fully understand issues like anxiety and depression?
I can't speak for all South Asians. I will say that I think generally increased media awareness is helping a lot. I think that it's just generally, right? I'm seeing it with what my parents are watching, how mental health is more of a theme in the shows that they watch, the movies they watch, the books they read, the podcasts they listen to. So I think that's really helpful for them to for all of us to just normalize it. We fear what we don't know. Something that is really underrepresented will feel scary to us when we are faced with it. And so the fact that there's more awareness means that we are normalizing the fact that this is just something that many of us, if not all of us, struggle with. And so I do think it's helping bridge that gap. Now, that can vary family to family depending on how much resistance there is, how much communication there is or isn't, and how these conversations end up going.
All right. One more question I think will really resonate with you, Sahed. Here we go. I'm a young Indian American who just graduated college, and I feel like I have such big shoes to fill as the daughter of immigrants. How do I separate my career goals from what my parents want of me? I feel like my career goals are so heavily influenced by the goals they created for me decades ago.
Yeah, this is a very common thing I hear. I work with a lot of adult daughters of immigrants, children of immigrants who are, maybe a little later in life. I'm using quotes because there's no timeline of finally being able to then interrogate, are these choices I'm making for myself, or am I making this choice because it looks good to others or my parents wanted it of me? So just honor that. Have a lot of self-compassion. You made choices because you thought they were right at the time. There was a different version of you that made these choices based off of different metrics, which was maybe making your parents happy, maybe doing the easier route, but you're also allowed to spend some time reflecting on what is important to you now. You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to interrogate your values. You're allowed to decide that maybe you have different values. And ultimately, what, the goal here, especially with the privilege that many of us have because of our parents' choices and sacrifices, we can now decide to live a values-driven life rather than a goals-driven life. And really rooting into what those values are, how they differ and compare to your parents, and understanding and kind of normalizing being around people who might be choosing different things to be able to see what's accessible to you, what our opportunities are to you, can help you really focus in on making choices that are important to you and differentiating that from what was expected of you.
Thank you so much, Sahej. And last question, I always ask this one from you. I'm really interested to hear the answer. And that is, after everything you've experienced and studied, what gives you hope?
Oh, a lot gives me hope. I think, you know, I think it's right now, hope is such a commodity for so many of us, and it's something that so many of us want to lean into. And I think for me, there is the bigger hope, the macro hope in like grassroots organizations, in the fact that because of social media, the benefit of it is that we can connect with other people so much more easily. We can understand and be more informed so easily, and we can see people with what they're doing in ways that we never really had access to before. And that really gives me hope. On a micro level, my nephews give me hope. The next generation gives me hope. The fact that there are, more of us there are many more people who are blending together their families and their partners and their choices, causing us to like even more bridge that gap between different cultures and different generations gives me hope, because it lets us stop othering ourselves so much. And it really just leans into the beauty of the diversity, but also we're all more similar than we think. And I think that it's really important for us to remember that, and that really gives me hope.
Thank you, Sahaj. Those are beautiful words to end on. So special thanks today to Sahaj Kohli for your wonderful conversation, and to Jackie Tan from Mercer Island Parent Edge for joining us today. Lots of love coming from the audience, lots of lovely comments and support from everybody in the chat. So again, thank you so much, Sahaj. You were doing great work. Everybody pick up her book. It's a fantastic read. She didn't spend 6 years at Huffington Post for nothing. It is really beautifully written. So
Thank you so
Sahaj,
much.
thank you. Jackie, thank you.
Thank
And
you.
take care, everybody. We'll see you again soon.